God damn it. I try to be all serious and poised, and then the record goes on.
You think this is how I want to introduce our podcast?
What conditions or stipulations, magic tricks or manipulations, interjecting conversation? I don't wanna talk about it. We're gonna have to talk about it. You don't wanna talk about it. We're gonna have to talk about it.
All right,
We've been gone
for
for weeks.
I know. God damn it. And it was for such a sobering reason, and here we are. Back on Exceedingly Persuasive. Regardless of what has brought you grief this year plus, sometimes you just gotta grin and bear it and lean into it, because life sucks,
What else
man.
are you gonna
do? So anyways, yeah, this is Exceedingly Persuasive. I'm Mackenzie Brennan.
I am Brooke Rogers. Thank you for joining us. We missed you.
Yeah, thank you guys so much for your patience. For those of you who are not on Instagram, because Brooke was helping me out with keeping everybody updated and just like staying in touch with my very sporadic communications. So in February, one of my best friends, Lindsay Schofield Kramer, lost her husband, Bobby Kramer, who was also a good friend, when he was killed by a drunk driver going the wrong way in Arizona. So, and they also have a 2-year-old. His name is Arthur, and he's wonderful. But this was very much not their plan. And they were a great young family. Lindsay and Arthur still are, just really sweet, wonderful people. And their world was just shattered by somebody who apparently during a pandemic on a Tuesday night decided, I'm going to get drunk enough to drive the wrong way and kill someone on the highway. So I was out there just spending some time with the family and helping, I don't know.
Helping them just deal with the aftermath.
Figure out whatever the hell you can figure out in a time like that. And even just simple things like childcare, which actually parlays into our episode topic. But thank you guys so much for your patience. I know it was kind of unpredictable, and I didn't have a great plan of what was going on either. But if you do want to donate, because obviously Lindsay and Arthur were not prepared for this at all. Bobby was doing really well in his career. He was a mixologist and a restaurant part owner. And now he's out of the picture. So
and he was the primary breadwinner for the family.
He was, yeah. And he was also a Navy veteran. He was a Navy medic, and just like a really warm, positive person. He was her high school sweetheart too. So just like the uprooting of this bullshit act, whatever. In any event, if you want to donate, it would be really, really appreciated. You can Venmo me with the subject Bobby, and my Venmo is at MKZBrennan. And I'll send you a little screenshot as a receipt and a promise that it made its way. But we all really appreciate it, and thank you.
No, it's not something that anyone sees coming, and it's to have it happen to someone who was a husband and a father of, a toddler, was heartbreaking, and a friend, and just very, very loved by so many people. It's something like that is just, it completely changes the course of your life. So our thoughts are with Bobby's loved ones, and we appreciate those of you who have sent your kind thoughts already.
Really appreciate it. And Lindsay does too. She's obviously so scattered, but she's gone through and liked a lot of the Venmo transactions. So it makes a huge difference, especially in early days when after every death, it sucks so much that there's this business of death that comes after, that life doesn't stop when your world stops. And it's just a lot to reconcile, but especially when it's something this abrupt and tragic. Like Bobby was 31, Lindsay's 29, Arthur is 2, obviously. That just to ease, especially this early burden, is really important. So I appreciate so much what you guys have given and said so far. And Brooke, thank you for facilitating a lot of that.
Of course, yeah.
And
yes.
yeah, so that's all I will say about that. But
yeah, but no, yeah, we're just
explanation.
really thankful for everyone's patience and
Yeah.
just the love and kindness that was sent toward
Yeah.
Bobby and his family.
Love your people, and also please use a ride service. If you cannot afford one, you can't afford to drink. Like that, simple as that. Just
Yeah, I
don't
mean, use a ride service, designate somebody as a sober driver, get a ride home from the bar in any way you can. But just, yeah, don't get behind the wheel of a car if you're not sober. It's so dangerous. So many lives end this way.
It's crazy that still this happens.
Yeah, I mean, you put yourself in danger, you put other people in danger, and it's just not worth taking someone else's life or your own. There's always another option besides getting behind the wheel of a car drunk.
Yeah.
If it's Uber or Lyft or whatever it is, just cab, honestly, cab. Just asking, having a friend come pick you up. Anything is better than driving drunk. So
that is true. So speaking of the, I don't know, unintended costs and difficulties of unplanned family consequences. Maybe
okay,
that,
this is not a clean transition. But the other day I was, it's story time with Brooke Rogers.
Reading about the Pope, as one does.
Well, actually, I was taking my birth control pill, as I do every day. And
at a girl.
I was looking at my little pack of pills, and I take all of my active pills back to back. So there's for those of you who don't know, there's 4 lines of pills generally 4 lines of pills in a birth control pack, and 3 of them are one color. And then there's a 4th line, which represents a week. That's a different
28 color. Days. So you got essentially a 4-week dosage. Yeah.
Right. It's supposed to match up with your cycle. And I was thanking the gods of modernity once again that
modern science.
Don't have to have a period because I can take these pills back to back, because my periods were awful when I did have them and I don't want to do it anymore. Yeah. And the fact that I can opt out of that is amazing. And then I asked myself, why does anyone take these placebo pills at the end of the month and have their period if it's, if there's an option not to? Now, there are reasons why you would want to.
And I will qualify this that a lot of the placebo pills, it varies the number of days. So I was on a pill for a while that only had a 4-day placebo course, because essentially you just want to alert your body to slough off the lining of the uterus, which even with birth control will fluff itself up a little bit, just because it does that regardless. Get fluffed. So it has to slough off all the puffy.
Like one of those beta fish.
Yeah.
It frills up at the end of the month.
So it basically is just signaling with a different dosage of hormones that it's time to get rid of all that and start again, which, like you're saying, it's not really necessary to fluff and unfluff and refluff in that strict sense if you're not planning for a baby and your body isn't producing or releasing eggs at that point. So
this baby factory is closed for business.
Yeah, the baby factory is sleeping right now. For an indeterminate
NAFTA moved in and the factory shut down.
Oh boy. Amazon set up shop and now all the local egg businesses are DOA.
They had to pack up their tiny suitcases and move out. That was
so the pills, the placebo pills actually do have iron supplements in them too, which are useful because sometimes the body will bleed because it thinks it's supposed to. And so that happens and you want to re-up your iron supplies. I get very anemic. And when you're losing blood, obviously you're losing iron. So sometimes the placebos do that. There is some thought about are your hormonal side effects worse the more months that you don't allow for that gap in hormone dosage? So there are some things that are unresearched or unverified, but the bottom line is that Yeah, you don't need to be fluffing up your uterus and shedding the lining if you're not making babies. So you don't really need that gap.
I was like staring at these placebo pills, which, speaking of which, I'm very anemic as well, by the way.
All hot girls are anemic. Yeah.
I am both irony poisoned and iron deficient.
Yeah, we bruise like bananas in this house.
Yeah, I have bruises all over my legs 100% of the time, and I never know where they came from. And I know that's like basically a meme by now. Everyone's like, oh, women, they're always bruising their legs and, you know, wanting to vote.
Bitches, women be bruising. But honestly, like periods and hormones are a huge part of that because you do tend to retain iron and keep it less with our
women are all anemic because women are all, you know, they're all bleeding for a week out of the month.
Lose a huge volume of blood every month. Yeah, sorry.
I don't take my placebo pills because I can't afford to lose any more blood. I already look like a newly fresh English corpse.
Please,
I don't need it
you look like Prince Philip as he was released, thriving and dead from the hospital this week. But yeah, so why have a period?
So
Brooke? That's my question.
I had remembered this thing in the back of my mind where I read somewhere that it was the Pope's fault somehow. And generally when people tell me it's the Pope's fault, I say, of course it is. I know it is. Not even like this Pope, Pope Francis. It's not even it's just the Pope, the not even the man, but the position. The office of the Pope has done so much. We don't even talk about the one that was a Nazi.
Girl, it's like pick your poison. And then you get back to the Crusades and we're just like, what degree of ill are you looking for this week?
So I remember in the back of my head that the Pope was responsible for there being placebo pills in birth control packs. And I was like, why do I think that? And, you know, again, my bias in general is just to blame it on the Pope. Probably, so I was like, maybe is this something that I made up? But no. When they were creating birth control pill packs, they decided to put the placebo in so that women would keep having periods because they thought it would placate the Catholic Church into allowing Catholic women to take contraception.
It just begs so many questions. It's like, because on the one hand, I'm like, why did they think that the bleeding was important? But then the next thought is like, yeah, you know what? They probably do. There's probably some weird old man church obsession with the bleeding part. Because usually they make up some roundabout nonsense way where it's like, in this line of the Bible, it talks about the rain that comes every month. So that means that God wants you to bleed and suffer to bear children. Like, I don't know. I don't know the exact argument made on behalf of that. Apparently their line was so much conception prevented, so many homicides. That was like the line that they would use when talking about any kind of birth control, including the wording of that makes no sense because it's like prevented is not akin to actively taking.
Right. So like, does life begin at conception or does life begin
as a sperm
before that? Yeah, this is like the 1950s. That's not that long ago.
The 60s. So now,
yeah, that's honestly, the lifetimes of our parents.
What do you think they say now? Because what we're talking about today is, oh boy, primarily birth control and abortion and women's health policy in Venezuela under Nicolas Maduro, and how both the US's domestic and international policy has affected that, and what countries should do in an international community when a very socially regressive and very needy country needs aid but is making very bad domestic policy decisions.
And also, I think in a broader, more like abstract sense, looking at Venezuela as a sort of test case, not to dehumanize it, but a test case in what happens when women are deprived of reproductive choice. And we talk all the time about, you know, theoretically about what would happen in the United States if abortion were made illegal in every state. In so many states, it already effectively functionally is, because women have to drive to other states to access healthcare or they can't, because they can't take a day off their jobs. They can't pay for it. Like, there are a lot of places where practically it is impossible to access reproductive care. But, what would it look like if not only abortion were made illegal in all 50 states, but also what happens when women have zero control over their own reproductive lives because they don't have access to birth control or contraception of any kind. And it's
Which
sort
apparently
of this,
now we only realize things when they come to their absolute worst. I mean, you look at the COVID crisis and people can yell and scream about policy and say, like, this is going to happen, this is going to happen, please don't let this happen. And there's something about the way that our national attitudes and understanding of civics has gotten that and maybe it's a little bit that we're desensitized by now too, because a lot of things are, I mean, you and I have joked about how everything under the last administration was unprecedented. And it's like, yeah, but it kind of was. That we kind of, you almost have to get numb to people saying this is a really bad thing until or unless it gets really, really bad. And it gets to that point where people are dying in an immediate sense. So again, like you said, not to dehumanize or distance the reality of the situation in Venezuela, but here we have a very close to home in a human sense example of what we've been saying will happen and does happen when these resources don't exist. Right. But other structures also aren't in place to help out children that are born, women who are taken out of the workforce and don't have health care, a lot of side effects of the immediate problem too.
Right, because when women don't have any control over family planning or when they have children at all, because they don't have access to, and say that you don't believe in choice. Say you're pro-life, but maybe you're also like hesitant about birth control if you're religious and you don't like the idea of contraception or whatever. It's like, this is what happens when women don't have any control over when they have children or how many children they have. The results on their daily life can be devastating. The economic impact of that on yourself, on the children that you do have, on your family, on your community is something that I don't think we really think about.
And the government at large. I mean, there's the community in a local sense, and then there's the fact that we're talking about a country that in a way that's related and in a way that will get a lot worse is already struggling a lot economically. And the solution is let's add, Maduro apparently told every woman to have 6 children on top of this. So it's like we have a strapped financial system, insufficient aid structures, let alone things like education and healthcare to prevent negative impact. But we're going to take money out of the system further by distributing it over exponentially more people. And then, I mean, honestly, to bring it down to a much more individual level, and I don't know, I feel so pessimistic about people understanding the humanity argument in the way that I'd like them to about women picking their careers and being humans in the same way that some men
are allowed to
think of themselves. Yeah, but in the article that Brooke sent me in the New York Times about this problem, a woman was talking about how she wanted to be a chemist, and now that was on hold. So simple things like huge existential things for the individual, but individual level things like I want to be educated, I want a job, which ultimately pays the country back. And then as somebody who just stayed with a 2-year-old, waking up at 4:30 in the morning, we get him to nap when he needs to nap. You have to watch him 24/7. It's a multi-person job for one child to have the right resources. And then you think of the generation of people that you're creating who don't have any of that, plus don't have healthcare, plus don't have money for education. It's a huge slippery slope.
No, absolutely. The way that not being able to control when or if you have children affects the each individual woman on a class level and increases poverty for women who are already struggling is not something I think that we often consider. And especially in places where people are already struggling. So in Venezuela right now, what drew my attention to this issue and the main source that we built off of here is an article called Venezuelan Women Lose Access to Contraception and Control of Their Lives in the New York Times. It's by Julie Turkwitz and Asain Herrera. The country, Venezuela itself, has been in an economic crisis for some time. And it's been worsened in recent years, in the last 15 years or so, by sanctions, which we'll get to later. But the crisis there is at a place where the minimum monthly wage is about $1.50. Most people have trouble
adjusting a bit for inflation too, because I think they have huge inflation there and a different currency, I believe. Right.
It's $1.50 in US dollars. But there is not only a lack of access to jobs, there's a lack of access to food, medical care of any kind. I'm reading from the article now. A pack of 3 condoms cost $4.40, which is 3 times Venezuela's monthly minimum wage. Monthly minimum wage. Birth control costs more than twice as much, roughly $11 a month. Well, an IUD or intrauterine device can cost more than $40, more than 25 times the minimum
long-term
wage.
Solution.
Right. If you wanted to get something that would actually prevent you from becoming pregnant for a long period of time. And that does not include the doctor's fee to have the device put in. On top of all of this lack of access.
Interject that this also connects to things, we were talking about it being a cautionary tale in terms of women's health policy, but you also see things like recent conversations that Republicans vetoed in Congress about raising the minimum wage, about universal health care, because I'm thinking about things like monthly cost of birth control. That's not just a one-off that you take the card for a month. You have to pay that every month. And things like universal health care could reduce the cost, whether it be here or there. I mean, it's a socialized country, so you would expect that sort of thing to help, but you see the risks of not having health care covered.
No, absolutely.
In a legitimate way.
On top of this, women had been using abortion as a last resort, and abortion is illegal in Venezuela. So they were having to utilize sort of an underground system of healthcare to access abortion. And this predominantly stopped in January of this year. Women's activists halted unofficial abortion services after the arrest of a university professor who helped a 13-year-old girl who was raped end a pregnancy. The professor was arrested, and it spooked everyone else.
So now that it's just not an option to get
now
underground?
it was already
not as much.
It was already very dangerous to get an abortion, both because of the legal implications of it, and because the 2 ways to access abortions were the sort of more obviously dangerous one, which is they would try to perform a surgery, not often having the right tools or the right facilities.
Or, medication afterwards to prevent infection, because that's what I think, bleeding and infection would be a huge thing if you're essentially scraping the uterus without proper antibiotics.
In the New York Times article, they talk about a 24-year-old woman who already had children, and she couldn't afford to provide for another one. So she went into an abortion, and her uterus was punctured, and she died on the table. So
because, you don't have imaging, you don't have professionals necessarily doing it. It's like when you said that about the illegal or alternative procedures halting in January, it's dark, but I thought like the only worse thing than a back alley abortion is no back alley abortion. is that
Yeah.
there just simply is
They
not
don't-
an option. Because then what do you do if you don't have the last resort?
Right. And the other
We'll see.
option for abortions were there is this a pill you can take. It's supposed to be taken when it's given in the US. It's a pill that both can induce an abortion. It's also used in after miscarriages to help the body cleanse itself.
It's called misoprostol, and it's prescribed for, in the US, for example, and is thus safe for this use, whether you have what's called a fetal death, which is a miscarriage, but it hasn't been expelled naturally and the body isn't doing that on its own, or it can be used in tandem with another drug that kind of lessens the side effects of telling your body to expel something, and essentially like doing aggressive cramps, triggering aggressive cramps to detach and expel the contents of your uterus, which can be very uncomfortable. But the bottom line is that you can use it for an abortion, and it's something that, if prescribed correctly and monitored, and the actual real version of the medication, because that's where the problem ends up being with a lot of these cases, it can be done at home. It's something that your doctor or prescriber can send you home with, and over the next week you may have some discomfort, but you can do it at home and be fine and recover. But the problem is that prescribing that or having that drug in Venezuela is no longer legal. So you turn to alternative means of getting what is alleged to be the drug.
And it's still, so some women are still accessing the second dose of this drug. So it's supposed to be administered in 2 doses.
Vendors.
It's supposed to be administered in 2 doses. The first dose is supposed to prepare your body for expulsion. The second dose actually helps move everything out. But the problem is that a lot of women can't get the first dose in Venezuela. And the first dose makes it a far more comfortable process. It's still going to be uncomfortable and painful in some ways, or it can be.
It depends on the person, but yeah, right. I mean,
but the situation in Venezuela is such that women are almost always, if they can even afford to take the drug at all, they're only taking the second dose, which makes it an extremely painful, days-long process. And because it's illegal, they have to find a safe place to have the abortion by themselves. So they are having they're experiencing 4-day-long abortion processes in warehouses, or alone in hotels, or at friends' houses.
If you can get the time off work. I mean, if that's even an option. Part of the problem, which is it might actually be worse. The New York Times mentions this Jose Vende Todo website, which is essentially Jose sells everything. And that's where this woman in the article got the medication. That we don't even know that it is misoprostol. It could be a little bit of that. It could be none of that, cut with drain cleaner. It could be any number of things that will, yes, make your body expel all contents of the uterus, but we don't know. And that's kind of what that's your best case scenario if there's nothing legal, because
you have to take that option because you don't have any other options. And it's excruciating. If you don't take the first dose, it's an excruciating process if you're only taking the second. But this is literally the only option that women have. And one of the stories, again, in the New York Times article, was of a girl who was assaulted by her boyfriend, and she had to get the abortion. So it's not even so simple that you can say, like, okay, well, and not that this should even have to be part of the conversation, but someone might say, well, okay, if they can't access any kind of contraception or birth control, why not just choose abstinence? They don't have to have sex, which is like a completely heartless and like ridiculous way to look at it, because that's just not how human beings, like, you shouldn't have to rely only on abstinence in order to be able to control your own sexual health. But that's not even a choice, because a lot of these women who are being forced to make these choices were sexually assaulted. So it's just, it's dehumanization on top of dehumanization.
And you think this makes a person for that person's whole life. And so whether or not you have children, I don't have children. I love, for example, Arthur. I would want every opportunity for him. And then I imagine a mother with children, same deal. That if you can't give every opportunity to your child or any potential child, you don't want to make that person, because it's not fair to them, let alone it not being fair to you. So,
and in a lot of these cases, these women already have children. And one of the first stories that they talk about in the New York Times article is a 25-year-old, it's my age. She is pregnant with her 6th child. She already has 5 children and she's pregnant with her 6th. Her and her husband have been looking for contraception for years. They are constantly looking for birth control and condoms. They very rarely can access them. So they just keep having children because there isn't another option. And again, yeah, you can say like, if your first instinct is like, okay, well then just don't have sex anymore. Yes,
they tried. It sounded like they tried that Venezuelan women were forced into that position after Chavez and in Maduro's regime. It sounds like
a lot of women chose to be abstinent, but again, it's not
and couples too. But then obviously you factor in things like overt assault and things like pressure in a marriage, for example. Well, in agency and priorities. I mean, you think about it takes 2 to tango and sometimes 2 to not tango, and the male partner's incentive to not do it is going to be very different than the female partner's because the burden is so directly different. Weighted one way. And not only that, but like when we are talking about solutions to this, I think the solution should be focused on, okay, so how do we get these women, and instead of asking them to do something like abstain from sex, it should be, how do we get these women birth control? How do we get them access to reproductive health care? How do we, give them more bodily autonomy in general? And the problem is just that this has been a situation that has been compounding on itself for 2 decades. It's not only a social issue in that even in the article, there's a woman who was quoted as saying that Maduro never got over his way of looking at women as incubators. And so there's a social side of this where like what we were saying as a joke with the sperm thing, that it's just a place to put your babies for a little while until they're fresh. And I think that like there are, so it's not only a problem of like a very socially regressive view of women, there's not only that social aspect, but the much more overwhelming and the much bigger hurdle to overcome is the economic aspect, where like even if this were a country that had great views on gender and sex and agency and consent, they don't even have the choice. They don't even have the choice to use contraception or have any control over their bodies because it's not there. They just don't have access to pills or IUDs or condoms even. I mean, I'd caution that it's both. I don't know that it's more economic than it is social, because I think you look at a country like the US, which in a relative sense does have the resources for those sort of things to be accessible. We also have the resources for them to be more accessible with proper allocation of money. But it does illustrate to you a little bit that you really need both in tandem. But I think, to your point, the economic piece is making a nearly impossible social regime fully impossible, because it's not even like, say, as we could, knock on wood, and it got tenuous there for a while, but as we could under Trump, you could still buy condoms. You could still get your birth control pills, although his court messed with abortion laws, and a lot of states did, and pricing of birth control, et cetera, things were going downhill. That even with the regressive government and it spreading into other branches beyond the executive, we still had the option in our economy to access those things. Even if the price got higher and the supplies were more limited and things looked bleak. So
the
that
majority of people could still buy condoms. A lot of people could still access, and as like, you know, we've talked about on the podcast how birth control needs to be more accessible in the US. And I think that's very much true, and affordable. I mean, if I were in charge, we'd just be like dumping boxes of
put them in vending
dummy
machines.
version birth control onto like every city in America.
They are safe enough to be over the counter because, like you and I have talked about, they have them over the counter in a number of countries. They're definitely safe enough. It's fine. Some college campuses have actually done dry runs of putting them in vending machines, and it's gone very well.
Yeah, there's no reason why it should not be more accessible, except that America has this weird obsession with controlling women's sex lives and controlling when they can or if they do have children, but it's not to this extent as it is in Venezuela. And so again, we're looking at an example of how bad things can get for not only women, but their children, their families, their communities, when they don't have access to any kind of control over their reproductive lives.
If this isn't enough for you, as we've said with a lot of social issues, if the immediate human impact isn't enough, usually the pro-social progressive policy front is also logically helpful to the economy at large. So with setting aside the immediate effect on the women and the children produced from this, from any lack of access, you got the women are not getting adequate health care. They're like, forget mental health because that is out the window. But physical health care for like prenatal care, postnatal care, because maternity death rates are also very, very high. You know, if you have good women's health care, they're going to give you things like misoprostol, which allows you to expel miscarriages. That you can't have one without the other. So a lot of things suffer. The resources for healthcare are much more diluted because there are more people in the system. Children having adequate education just becomes impossible. Again, like I said, Maduro has urged women to have 6 children each, and the financial burdens on a government of an already strapped populace creating 6 people each, that just doesn't distribute well.
The reality of the situation is that a lot of these people are having trouble feeding themselves, much less their children.
Like quality of life plummets for
themselves. They can't provide for their kids because the economy is so is in such a crisis. And that is a good jump to why are we talking about this?
Well, beyond the obvious,
beyond the obvious human issue, but it's like, okay, so we're not just talking about this to discuss this. We're not just talking about it because it's like, oh,
like what do we do?
What bad situation in Venezuela? The U.S. has had a direct impact on what's going on in Venezuela through sanctions that have been imposed on the country for almost 2 decades. And this has there was just a UN. So let me pull this up. What was the actual
special rapporteur?
A special rapporteur for the UN recently issued a report calling the U.S.-led sanctions on Venezuela devastating to human rights and the population there. The Alina Duhan, I believe her name is. And actually,
was she the rapporteur? So just to backtrack a little bit about where we're standing now. So while you're looking up, so the prior administration before Maduro was Hugo Chavez, who I'm sure that's a name much more familiar to a lot of folks. He and G.W. Bush did not like each other. There were a lot of nasty sentiments on both sides. I don't know enough to delve into who was right, who was wrong. I seem to remember something about Americans being demons, and then obviously G.W. Bush hit back with these sanctions. And it goes back even further because Venezuela, despite being a huge oil producer and a member of OPEC, which is the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. So obviously we care about them and we need them in some sense. They allied themselves with Cuba and were a socialist government early on and in that region when it mattered in post-Cold War years. So there's a lot of animosity going on there, especially with Republican administrations. But for a long time, there was also a kind of dependency because they had huge oil reserves in the Lake Titicaca region, which I did not make up.
We're not just throwing that in there.
I didn't. It's real. For shits and tits.
Shits and tits. We should put that on a t-shirt. For shits and tits.
For shits and Lake Titicaca. For shits and tits.
Going back to like what you're talking about with the like long-term animosity.
Yeah.
Again, the fact that Venezuela, even though it's not really, it's technically calls itself a socialist country. It's an extremely corrupt socialist country. So it's not functioning the way that democratic socialist countries
look at the cost of healthcare
countries function. It's
I mean, when you were reading off the cost of medicine that can be over the counter being more than the monthly minimum wage, that's not proper socialized medicine. That's not the implementation that is intended when you say socialized medicine.
But
so yeah,
the fact that this
not
regime calls itself socialist,
it's the Cuba socialist era. It's that whole like, God, Red Scare, commie nonsense.
I mean, you look at
was evil in some ways, but
since the Cold War, since before the Cold War, there has been extreme animosity toward any group that labels itself, any group or country or organization, anyone that labels themselves leftist, communist, socialist. There has been a lot of not only scrutiny from the U.S. government, but heavy-handedness in sanctions and implementing regime change. We saw that with the Sandinistas in Nicaragua in the 70s. We saw that all over Central America during the 60s and 70s. They were very invested in making sure that quote unquote socialism didn't take a foothold.
Basically, we got our way. I think at a certain point, and this is why we need women in charge, it was just like these ego-based pissing contests that we didn't want to lose at a certain point. And we wanted our guys, and we wanted control, and we wanted to show that we had the bigger military dick. It was really like that's what it came down to, especially in Central and South America.
I think that the U.S. government has had a vested interest in ensuring that any regime that claims to be socialist, even if it's not effectively socialist, does not succeed. And we especially around the Cold War, as you said, we saw that. And so there's always been a lot of animosity between the U.S. and the Cuban government, as you said, the U.S. and Venezuela.
Which that makes more sense because there were, nuclear warheads. So like, I don't want to suggest that the initial Cold War animus was fully out of nowhere, because obviously communism pre-Vietnam communism, I think, was a very different animal. And it was just as corrupted from the actual concept of textual communism or socialism. But because the Cuban government at no point was proper, perfect, anything that was human-centric. But, I digress, except that we held this grudge because at one point there was a real threat from a communist nation nearby. And so, like, the men in power just got really fucking invested in winning forever. Yeah. And here we are. So
I think that there was already a lot of bad blood between the U.S. and Venezuela. And then you have this whole, mean girls fight between Bush and Chavez for some reason.
Honestly, yeah.
I think they just didn't like each other.
Bush or Cheney and Chavez, I think, was probably what was happening, because usually that's
President Dick Cheney. Yeah.
Like, I don't see G.W. Bush sitting there being no.
I don't really think Bush was holding a lot of grudges back then. I don't really think he was holding anything.
Not a lot going on.
But the outcome of all this is that so in 2005, 2006, the U.S. implemented sanctions on Venezuela for a variety of issues. They said that they were not properly adhering to the drug trafficking related. Venezuela had failed to adhere to obligations under international narcotics agreements. There was also a terrorism-related sanctions in 2006, determining that Venezuela had not been cooperating fully with the United States' anti-terrorism efforts. These specific sanctions, even though they may have impacted the Venezuelan economy to some extent, they don't really have a lot of they were mostly like targeted sanctions, including it said that the the United States prohibited all commercial arms sales and retransfers to Venezuela. That's not really what we're talking about here, but that's where the sanctions started, was in 2005, 2006.
And the catalyst isn't necessarily wrong. Like, sanctions as a general rule are not inherently good or bad. In a sense, it's essentially depriving another country of economic benefits that come from interacting with you. And in a very internationally interdependent world and market, especially one where we as the US are a very prominent, if not the prominent player, it has huge implications. But as we saw with Iran about 2 years ago now.
You tap into your Bush voice there.
Iran. Nuclear, like, it can be an effective tool to exert international pressure for things like human rights. Drug trafficking in Colombia and Venezuela was a huge problem, I think still is, and there was a lot of violence that came out of that. But it can be a way to exert pressure in an international scale without sending in military agents, without doing things that are directly violent and, use intrusion. Just as a side note, before we get too far off of this, I did look up some of Chavez's quotes about G.W. Bush.
Read them off, baby.
That I remember. At the UN, G.W. Bush, 2006, Chavez said, "Yesterday, the devil came here, right here, and it smells of sulfur still today." And then,
sorry, but that's the most metal thing that's ever been said about GW.
It's that I remember that being the smells of sulfur. It's kind of creative, like, it's kind of good.
He had a flair for the dramatic.
I mean, I get why Bush was mad, but it's kind of funny. More on Bush in 2006. "You're an alcoholic, a drunk, a liar, an immoral person, Mr. Danger. You are the worst, a psychologically sick man." So they didn't like each other, and obviously there's more going on here than just...
Why was he determined to make George W. Bush sound so cool, is my question. Mr. Danger? It's hard to make him sound so legit, but...
I know. Yeah, so I'm reading through, and there's a lot of... he's talking about Yankee shits, go to hell 100 times... So, yeah, Chavez...
He sounds like text you send back and forth to, like, an ex you have a beef with. It's like, go to hell 1,000 times. You're the devil.
Yankee shit.
You drunk.
Yeah. So, obviously, there was some tension there that I think escalated some of the economic strain beyond where folks on both sides of the aisle at the time wanted it to go. Because, again... at the time, under the Chavez regime, oil was doing pretty well. They still have very good reserves, but apparently these economic strains have not helped with that. But yeah, so sanctions in general. Brooke, you were saying they started in the Bush administration.
2006, yeah. Again,
those are kind of okay. More okay.
They didn't really have. Yeah, they were so targeted and so specific. That again, it's like they prevented firearm sales.
Okay, so not the whole economy.
And the drug trafficking related sanctions, again, didn't really have a widespread effect on on the economy itself. But in 2014, 2015, under President Obama, a couple executive orders were issued and one act was passed, the Venezuela Defense of Human Rights and Civil Society Act of 2014. It required the president to impose sanctions against those whom the president identified as responsible for significant acts of violence, serious human rights abuses, and or anti-democratic actions. They continue to extend this. So it's like this was implemented in 2014, but it's been extended to 2023.
And again, human rights and anti-democratic stuff did happen. And
there was suppression of protests around this time that they were concerned about.
And drug trade violence.
The majority of these financial sanctions were focused on Maduro himself, his wife, his son, his executive vice president, 8 Supreme Court justices, the leaders of the Venezuelan army, National Guard, National Police, governors, things like that. So it's like the director of the central bank. So it's
government,
it's the government itself. And they actually lifted sanctions against the former head of Venezuela's intelligence services after he broke ranks. So it was more targeted. It was more specific.
And seeing Maduro now, I would not be surprised to learn that there were human rights violations under his presidency in the past. It fits. It tracks.
There was the absolute suppression of free speech under Maduro, as well as other things. There's no doubt about that there was that going on. But then in 2017, August of 2017, President Trump expanded these sanctions. He issued an executive order which prohibited access to U.S. financial markets by the Venezuelan government. And it also restricted the state-owned oil company, which is that's their bread and butter. That's the main way that they make money. That's their main export.
Yeah, and I think Brooke and I were looking into it a little bit before, and Brooke, you said that they have the largest oil reserves in the world. And then now I saw that under Maduro, they are only able to tap that with one drill. So yeah,
their only competition is Saudi Arabia, which was interesting to me because by restricting the Venezuelan oil company, you are boosting the demand for Saudi oil,
and their
which
control.
The Saudis are an ally of the U.S. So there is some political, it's, at least in my opinion, it does seem like there would be some political drive to do that as well.
But Brooke, they don't commit human rights violations. So it's a totally different animal.
And that's it, isn't it? Because the way that I think this is actually the kind of the seed of my problem with these sanctions to begin with, is that even though it's inarguable that human rights violations have happened under the Maduro regime, the way that we pick and choose who we impose sanctions against depends a lot on how much how beneficial our relationship, staying on good terms with that country is. So Saudi Arabia is allies of ours. They are a huge source of oil. An
ally with Trump particularly. I mean, he was willing to turn heads on human rights abuses more than I think anybody else in the government, even on the Republican side, would have. But
it's not like it's not like we were any more cozy, towards Saudi Arabia underneath the Obama administration or the Bush administration. The Saudis have always gotten away with human rights violations under every one of these administrations.
I'd say Khashoggi, though, is a different level under Trump. Our government was just commanded to suppress any sort of retaliation for taking and killing a journalist for bad press.
Even though the CIA did identify that, not that the CIA is always like the most reliable source of info.
But I think, that in this case, they certainly were. And Trump demonized them.
The ties were so obvious between Khashoggi and Mohammed bin Salman, the prince of Saudi Arabia. Absolutely. It's like, it can't be denied. And everybody knew that Khashoggi had been killed. I mean, we did Saudi Arabia.
And let alone what the government knew. Apparently there were phone calls. But in any event, what does this mean? I think, Brooke, what you're saying is that you don't like the double standard that's used as an excuse to do something that cripples one country's economy for human rights abuses when we don't impose. It just seems like a false flag, right?
Mm-hmm.
That we're not doing this
It
for
seems
other
like we're
countries.
covering our actions in this like in this gloss of, oh, we're trying to promote human rights in Venezuela. And it's not that I'm saying that human rights abuses do not happen in Venezuela. I'm saying that I don't know if we're the best determiner of what human rights abuses are when we can turn a blind eye to Saudi Arabia killing Jamal Khashoggi and their treatment of gay people and women for the entire time for centuries, and pretend that we like have some like that we're holding our nose at Venezuela, and this is the reason why we are implementing these sanctions in the first place.
So yeah,
it doesn't make any sense to me. It's like, okay, so
I agree with it.
Do we really care about human rights abuses? If
this is a good excuse to talk about negative intervention versus positive intervention and how sanctions can be used to positive end and not so positive end, because in an international policy sense, I do think that this is the better alternative to and taking a step back from the actual circumstance, but just in a general sense, sanctions are a less intrusive and less domestically taxing way to enact international change. When we don't have a lot of means of affecting other countries' domestic policy, because the UN, as the second UN Secretary General described it, was not designed to take us to heaven. It's designed to keep us from hell. So there aren't a whole lot, there's not an enforcement body. The Security Council has vetoes from a lot of these corrupt countries like China and Russia. So what we have as a domestic superpower is financial control of our own market. And it's a huge market, and it does have a lot of effects. But in terms of who we treat in which way, I think you're absolutely right that it's not in good faith in a human sense, in a logical sense, but a lot of political progress, whether it be domestic or international, isn't like, you kind of take the wins you can get. So I'm hesitant to turn away from anything that prioritizes human rights in one place, even if, like, I would rather not step back from that just to even the playing field lower on the scale.
And that's true if the sanctions on the Maduro regime were having some positive effect, I might agree with you. But this UN report from Alina Dohan specifically outlines how the sanctions are quote unquote constitute violations of international law and have exacerbated Venezuela's economic crisis with ineffective and insufficient carve-outs for humanitarian issues. Basically, the sanctions have crippled the economy, and the people who are being hurt by it are not the Maduro regime. It's the people at the lowest classes, the most impoverished people in Venezuela. And so and
the carve-out sounds, that's probably the key to it, right? That there could be things like carve-outs to allow extra money for medical care, for contraceptive access, for things that would directly impact this.
And just reading directly from the report, impediments to food imports constituting more than 50% of food consumption have resulted in the steady growth of malnourishment in the past 6 years. Also the impact of trade sanctions is particularly felt in the Venezuelan countryside, where agriculture activities have all but stopped since imports of diesel fuel have dried up. So the trade sanctions implemented primarily by Trump in 2017, 2018, and I believe 2019 as well, he like tripled down on these sanctions. And funny enough, through enacting 3 executive orders. So this wasn't through Congress, it wasn't through the legislature. It was through executive orders that he prevented transactions of cryptocurrency. He iced Venezuela out of the financial markets. and prohibited transactions related to purchasing Venezuelan debt. So this just like kneecapped Venezuela's economy.
Anything, and it is worth noting that executive orders, that for international issues, it's the one field that it's more common to have executive orders be the instrument, because the executive has a lot of international power. But that said, when you hear all these issues about implementation, because when we talk about the special rapporteur's report for the UN, that's on the sanctions at large in Venezuela. It's not specific to this women's health issue, which has suffered in response. But you think about the Trump administration, who was doing foreign policy, who was drafting these things. I don't imagine that it was anyone who was particularly well versed at execution of these sort of things and human rights carve-outs and policy carve-outs in general, let alone if it's related to women's health and access to that sort of thing. So it comes as no surprise that this is poorly executed. So if you're up for it, I would wrap up with the unresolved question of what we do in this case, which has come up a lot of times before and will again, of countries beyond our own that are related to our economy somehow, obviously, because everybody is, and are in need of dire financial support. And the people didn't do anything wrong. I mean, the
or
citizens
at least
are just living there.
At least allow not even active aid, but just releasing our vice grip on their economy, letting them trade and interact with the market would be, I think, helpful. Yeah, and the humanitarian carve-outs,
like tailoring these sort of things,
like as you said before,
right?
The previous sanctions are more targeted, so.
So it seems like something you could do and make effective use of a kind of non-interventionist intervention and international pressure.
Yeah.
That doesn't.
My opinion is that we should take the L, realize that the sanctions have not had their intended effect, which is pushing Maduro out in favor of Juan Guaido, who is the leader who's recognized by the United States due to contested election in, I believe, 2017, which is when Trump first implemented the new sanctions. Realize that this is not having the intended effect, realizing that it's actually hurting the Venezuelan people more than it's hurting Maduro or his regime, and step back and look at the sanctions that we have and eliminate the ones that are crippling the Venezuelan economy. And if we wanted to target Maduro and his people, the people in his government specifically, like the ones in 2005, 2006, and under the majority of the ones under Obama, did, but in a way that we know we're not just harming people who are already in an extremely bad situation.
It seems like you could almost just repeal and replace in one fell swoop, that it wouldn't have to be get rid of the measures and wait and retailor something, especially if a lot of this is done through executive order. Just replace it in an executive order that makes the requisite carve-outs and instead, gets rid of the sanctions and targets whatever entities and maybe businesses at large. Like, there might be national economies and national scale things in Venezuela that would do well to be targeted if they're weapons sales or governmental entities, whatever. That you could just replace it in one action with something that is better targeted and with the requisite carve-outs for international aid, medical help, financing those sorts of efforts, whatever.
Yeah. And I think that it's not like, there aren't people who understand the situation and can give advice and expertise about, like, Biden, okay, this is what we can do. Yeah.
They know what they're doing. Like,
I know very little about Biden's specific, feelings about what's going on in Venezuela now, feelings or what his policy
expertise, right? Like, because that's kind of the line I draw. I don't know if I agree with what they're doing, but every administration, save for Trump, at least hired experts. And so in that sense, I'm like, at least if they do something, it's intentional. Which is less than we can say for who drafted the last orders. So,
Well, I mean, it does seem like if the intention was to harm,
Well,
Venezuela, I don't know what Trump was intending
yeah,
to
I
do.
mean, you're right in the sense that he was just like, fuck you. And that was it. That was
Mhm.
the extent of his feeling on anything.
But I don't think that if we don't know what we're doing in Venezuela, we should get out of Venezuela's business. That's what I'm like. It's like but we don't. I feel like there are people who can explain and look. I mean, we look at this UN report itself, and it's like obviously it's pointing out that there are flaws with the sanctions that we've put in place now, and it's telling us how we can adjust those sanctions in a way that's not going to be as harmful to the Venezuelan people. So that to me seems like a solution right there. It's like, okay, we
just
know
draft
how.
in accordance. Yeah.
Yeah.
Because we're kind of out of Venezuela now. And that's the distinction between these negative sort of reactions, which are pulling ourselves out and saying, you can't interact with our economy, you can't get money from us. And what they did with School of the Americas and
More assertive.
and interventionists, like actually going in and sending people in, that this tends to be the more pull out way of intervening in general. So it beats the alternative in the sense of like boots on the ground or training militias. But because it basically just says you can't play with us. And so what we want is them to be able to play with us morally.
Yeah. And I think one thing that we talk a lot about how, okay, so these sanctions just say like you can't interact with our markets, but one thing that popped out to me in the CNN article on the special UN report is that it says U.S. led. I think that's key because it's not just that the U.S. is implementing these sanctions; the EU is also implementing these sanctions because they tend to follow our lead. And so it's like, not only are we signaling to Venezuela, not only are we signaling to Venezuela that we are going to put our boot down, maybe not physically, but metaphorically on them, but we're signaling to other countries that they should do the same. So this,
and
by
especially
pulling
if
out and easing,
allies, they have to. Yeah.
By easing up on them, I think that other countries will follow suit, and hopefully the people of Venezuela won't be under so much financial pressure.
We shall see. And this is a nice, if not actually nice, way to tie it up. And the other thing that I would say has a ripple effect, like you're saying, on an international scale, is the domestic atmosphere that the Trump administration has created. That you think of countries that weren't to where we were before the Trump administration and even after, seeing how little we prioritize healthcare in general, especially women's health, reproductive health, etc. And when you're talking about other countries getting our signal in relation to sanctions, the same absolutely applies in relation to messaging about how much women matter, how much children matter, how much control over your own body matters, and
how much lifting people out of poverty matters.
Yes. And we signaled that is not a priority from the largest economic power in the world. So why would anyone else prioritize it?
Yeah. So, and there's a chance that if we lift these sanctions, the Venezuelan economy will continue to, because it wasn't like the economic crisis in Venezuela was happening before the sanctions were implemented. Lifting these alone might not be enough to lift Venezuelans out of poverty,